December 7, 1943. The skies above the Rhine Valley churned with grey winter clouds as a formation of American bombers pushed deeper into enemy territory. At 23,000 feet, the air was thin and bitter cold, and inside the cramped fuselage of a bomber designated Baker 7, a young airman named James Wheeler gripped his navigation charts with frost-numbed fingers. The crew around him believed this would be another routine supply interdiction run, perhaps encountering light resistance from outdated interceptors. They had no idea they were flying into what would become one of the most documented aerial encounters of the European theater. An operation that would fundamentally challenge everything the military establishment believed about courage, capability, and who deserved to wear the uniform. Wheeler sat at his station, isolated not just by the roar of 4 Wright Cyclone engines, but by something far more oppressive. He was the only person of color in a crew of 9 assigned to a segregated unit that higher command had deemed suitable only for support roles and domestic duty. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of them knew, not the skeptical crew members who had protested his assignment, not the commanders who had reluctantly approved his training, was that within the next 6 hours, this man they had called useless would make a decision that would save not just their lives, but change the trajectory of integration in the American military forever. James Wheeler had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, where the son of a railroad porter learned early that the world would judge him twice as harshly, while giving him half the opportunity. His father, Thomas Wheeler, had worked for the Louisville and Nashville Railroad for 23 years, maintaining schedules with precision that earned respect from conductors and engineers, even as the company refused to promote him beyond porter. Young James had absorbed lessons from watching his father, understanding that excellence might not guarantee advancement, but mediocrity would certainly prevent it. When he enlisted in 1942, the recruitment officer had laughed openly at his request to train as a navigator. The military's prevailing wisdom, supported by pseudo-scientific reports that circulated through command structures, held that people of color lacked the intellectual capacity for technical positions. Wheeler was told he could serve in labor battalions, perhaps work in the mess hall, maybe drive trucks if he proved himself reliable. Navigation, bombing calculations, flight operations, those roles were reserved for others. But Wheeler had something the military hadn't counted on, a mind that consumed mathematics like other men consumed meals, and a stubbornness his mother had warned him would either make his fortune or get him buried. He had taught himself trigonometry from books borrowed from the Colored Library, a small collection housed in the basement of a church where the librarian, an elderly woman named Miss Patterson, had recognized his hunger for knowledge and quietly supplied him with whatever texts she could acquire. He studied astronomy from his grandfather's almanacs, learning to calculate celestial positions and use the stars for navigation long before he ever thought about flying in an aircraft. He could calculate fuel consumption rates and wind drift corrections faster than men with engineering degrees, his mind naturally seeing patterns and relationships in numbers that others struggled to comprehend. When the Army Air Forces began its experimental integration program in mid-1943, desperate for qualified personnel as casualties mounted in Europe, Wheeler's test scores were so exceptional that 3 separate officers reviewed them, convinced there had been an error. The first officer, a captain from Kansas named Henderson, had simply refused to believe the results and demanded Wheeler retake the examination under direct supervision. Wheeler scored 2 points higher on the second attempt. The second officer, a major with a degree in mathematics from Princeton, personally administered a third test, this one including problems he had designed himself. Wheeler solved them all, including 2 that the major later admitted he wasn't certain had solutions. The third officer, a colonel responsible for training assignments, called Wheeler into his office and asked bluntly whether he had cheated somehow. How else could someone with his background perform at this level? Wheeler had looked the colonel in the eye and said simply, "I studied, sir. Numbers don't care what color you are. Either you understand them or you don't. I understand them." There had been no error. Wheeler scored in the 98th percentile on spatial reasoning, the 96th on mathematical computation, and demonstrated an intuitive grasp of dead reckoning navigation that impressed even seasoned instructors who had been teaching the subject for years. His ability to visualize three-dimensional space, to maintain mental maps of position and movement, to account for multiple variables simultaneously, all of it marked him as exceptionally gifted. But scores on paper meant little against decades of institutional prejudice. When he finally received orders to join a bomber crew, the assignment came with a caveat. He would serve under probationary status, with his performance subject to review after every mission. One mistake, command made clear, and he would find himself peeling potatoes in some forgotten supply depot for the duration of the war. The crew of Baker 7 had received Wheeler with reactions ranging from cold professionalism to barely concealed hostility. The pilot, Captain Robert Morrison, a 26-year-old veteran of 14 missions, had personally filed a complaint with Squadron Command. Morrison came from a prominent Boston family, had attended Yale where he had been captain of the rowing team, and made no secret of his belief that the military's integration experiment was a dangerous distraction from winning the war. He had argued in his complaint that crew cohesion was essential for survival, that introducing someone who would face resentment from other crew members created unnecessary risk, that the experiment should be conducted in non-combat roles where mistakes wouldn't cost lives. The bombardier, Lieutenant Frank Kowalski, had simply refused to acknowledge Wheeler's presence for the first week. Kowalski came from a Polish immigrant family in Chicago, had worked in the stockyards before the war, and maintained strict ideas about proper social hierarchies. He ate his meals without speaking when Wheeler was present, responded to Wheeler's necessary communications with grunts or gestures, and made clear through every action that he considered the integration policy an insult to the men who had earned their positions through what he considered appropriate channels. The radio operator, Sergeant Tommy Riggs, from rural Georgia, had requested a transfer that was denied. Riggs had grown up in a sharecropping family, had left school after 8th grade, and held views on race that were common in his time and place, but that created obvious friction with Wheeler's presence. He had told other crew members that he couldn't trust a colored man with their lives, that the military's experiments were going to get people hurt, that he wanted no part of it. Only one crew member had extended anything approaching courtesy. Technical Sergeant Michael Chen, the flight engineer, had grown up in San Francisco's Chinatown and understood what it meant to navigate a world that judged you before you opened your mouth. Chen's parents had immigrated from China in 1921, had operated a small laundry that barely supported the family, and had raised their son to believe in the American promise of opportunity based on merit. Michael had experienced enough discrimination himself to recognize it in others, and he had made a conscious decision not to participate in what he considered unjust treatment of Wheeler. On Wheeler's first flight, Chen had quietly showed him where the crew kept emergency oxygen bottles, where the spare navigation equipment was stored, which coffee thermos actually had coffee, rather than the bitter chicory substitute some crew members preferred. Then he had offered a piece of advice that Wheeler would remember for the rest of his life. "Nobody cares about fare up here," Chen had said, checking fuel gauges with practiced efficiency. "They only care about getting home. You do your job better than anyone else can, and eventually even the worst of them will shut up and let you work. It won't be quick, it won't be easy. But excellence is the only argument that matters at 20,000 feet. Wheeler had taken that advice to heart. For 3 months and 11 missions, he had been flawless. While other navigators relied heavily on radio beacons and ground reference points, Wheeler could calculate positions using nothing but airspeed, heading, and elapsed time. His dead reckoning so precise that Morrison had grudgingly admitted the kid rarely missed by more than 5 miles, even on 5-hour flights. Wheeler plotted courses that accounted for predicted wind patterns based on weather reports and his own observations, identified optimal altitudes for fuel efficiency by calculating the relationship between air density and engine performance, and maintained logs so meticulous that intelligence officers used them as teaching examples for other navigators. Wheeler's navigation logs were works of precision that reflected not just technical skill, but an almost obsessive attention to detail. He recorded wind speeds and directions at multiple altitudes, noted temperature variations, documented fuel consumption rates under different flight conditions, tracked the performance of each individual engine. Other navigators kept basic logs that met minimum requirements. Wheeler kept comprehensive records that revealed patterns and relationships that could be analyzed for insights. That demonstrated a mind constantly learning and refining its understanding. But precision and competence hadn't translated to acceptance. The crew still ate without him, gathering in one corner of the mess hall while Wheeler sat alone or occasionally with Chen. They still shared jokes he wasn't part of, inside references from training or previous missions that served to remind him he was an outsider. They still found ways to make clear that he was there on sufferance, not as an equal, tolerated because orders required it, but not welcomed, not valued beyond his purely functional contribution to their survival. Morrison's reports praised Wheeler's technical skills, while noting concerns about crew cohesion. Military speak for the fact that Wheeler's presence made others uncomfortable, as if that was Wheeler's failing rather than theirs. The captain would write that Wheeler demonstrated exceptional navigational abilities, then add observations about crew integration challenges that suggested the problem was Wheeler's presence, rather than other crew members' prejudice. The reports walked a careful line, acknowledging capability while feeding into larger institutional concerns about whether integration could work in combat units. December 7th marked their 12th mission together, a deep penetration strike against industrial targets near Mannheim. The target was a complex of factories producing precision components for aircraft instruments, critical infrastructure that Allied command wanted destroyed, or at least severely damaged. Intelligence had briefed them on expected resistance, moderate anti-aircraft fire from approximately 30 batteries, possible interceptor activity from fighters based at nearby airfields, nothing the formation's fighter escort couldn't handle. The briefing officer, a major who had flown 20 missions before being transferred to planning duties, had assured them this would be a straightforward operation, challenging but manageable for experienced crews. The mission roster included 18 bombers from their group, part of a larger operation involving over 200 aircraft striking targets across Western Germany and occupied France. The strategy was to overwhelm defenses through sheer numbers, to force the enemy to divide their interceptor forces and anti-aircraft resources across too many targets, making it impossible to concentrate sufficient strength to stop any single element of the attack. It was attrition warfare applied to aerial bombardment, accepting some losses as inevitable while ensuring the majority of aircraft completed their missions. They would fly east across France, turn north over the Rhine, strike the targets, and return following the same route. Total flight time, estimated at 7 hours and 40 minutes. Wheeler had calculated 3 alternate routes, accounting for different wind conditions, marked emergency landing fields in Allied-held territory, ranging from established bases to recently captured airstrips barely long enough for heavy bombers, and prepared contingency plans for scenarios ranging from engine failure to unexpected weather to navigation equipment malfunction. His preparation was exhaustive, anticipating problems that might never occur, but ensuring he would have solutions ready if they did. The first sign that this mission would be different from the others came 90 minutes into the flight, when the formations crossed into enemy-held territory and the fighter escort, which should have numbered 36 P-47 Thunderbolts, appeared with only 19 aircraft. Someone in mission planning had made an error, or perhaps the other squadrons had encountered their own problems. Mechanical failures or weather delays or any of the 100 things that could disrupt carefully coordinated operations. Whatever the reason, the bomber formation pressed forward with half the expected protection, each aircraft now more vulnerable to interceptor attack. Morrison's voice crackled over the intercom, calm despite the implications that experienced crews immediately understood. "Navigator, confirm our position and distance to target." Wheeler checked his calculations, compared his plots against the landscape visible through intermittent cloud breaks below. The Rhine was visible as a silver thread through gaps in the clouds, exactly where it should be according to his computations. "We're at 51 degrees, 8 minutes north, 8 degrees, 12 minutes east," he reported. "On course on schedule. Target is 137 miles ahead, bearing 092 degrees. Current ground speed indicates arrival at the target in approximately 42 minutes. "Copy that," Morrison said. Then, after a pause that Wheeler felt more than heard, a hesitation that carried weight, Good work. Keep me updated on any changes. It was the first time the pilot had offered praise without qualification, without the subtle reservations that usually accompanied his acknowledgments of Wheeler's performance. The first time Morrison had spoken to him as simply another competent crew member rather than as the navigator they had been forced to accept. And Wheeler understood it for what it was, an acknowledgement that whatever came next, they would need him operating at his absolute best, that this was not a time for prejudice or social hierarchies, but for survival and capability. 20 minutes later, the anti-aircraft fire began. The German defenses around their target had been significantly reinforced since the last intelligence update 3 weeks prior. Where briefings had predicted 20 to 30 anti-aircraft batteries, the actual concentration appeared closer to 70 or 80 guns, possibly more. The sky erupted in black flowers of explosive shells, each burst capable of shredding aluminum skin and flesh with equal indifference, each one calculated to detonate at specific altitudes where bombers would be flying. Baker 7 bucked and twisted as Morrison threw the aircraft into evasive maneuvers, trying to avoid the predicted firing solutions that German gunners used to bracket formations. The bombardier called out corrections, tracking toward the release point where they would drop their payload of 12 500-pound bombs on the industrial complex below. Around them, Wheeler could see other aircraft in the formation, some trailing smoke from damaged engines, one falling away with an engine fire blazing orange against the grey sky, men tumbling from the stricken bomber as they abandoned the doomed aircraft. The bomb run required flying straight and level for approximately 3 minutes, making them perfect targets for the guns below. It was the most vulnerable moment of any mission, when courage and duty required men to fly predictably through walls of explosive metal, when the bombardier needed stable flight to achieve accurate aim, when every instinct screamed to take evasive action, but discipline demanded they hold course. It was a test of nerve that never became easier, regardless of how many times crews experienced it. Kowalski counted down to release, his voice steady despite the aircraft shaking from nearby bursts that sounded like someone beating the fuselage with giant hammers. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Bombs away. The bomber lurched upward as 4,000 pounds of ordnance fell toward the target. The sudden reduction in weight, creating a momentary buoyancy that Morrison had to compensate for to maintain formation position. Below, through gaps in the smoke from anti-aircraft bursts, they could see the bombs falling in a precise pattern, the bombardier's calculations translating into physical reality as the weapons tracked toward impact. Morrison immediately banked hard left, diving away from the worst of the anti-aircraft fire, following the pre-briefed evasion pattern designed to make the bombers harder targets. Behind them, secondary explosions bloomed among the factory buildings, indicating successful hits, fires spreading through structures that would burn for hours. But there was no time to assess damage or celebrate success. The formation was already turning for home, and new problems were developing. Wheeler heard Riggs, the radio operator, suddenly shouting over the intercom, his voice pitched higher with adrenaline and fear. Bandits, bandits, 4 o'clock high, coming fast. Multiple contacts, at least 20 aircraft. German interceptors, the feared Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters, had found them. Wheeler counted at least 20 aircraft diving toward the formation from higher altitude, far more than their depleted fighter escort could handle. The enemy had concentrated their interceptors, waiting until after the bomb run, when the formation was turning for home, timing their attack for maximum effect. The next several minutes dissolved into chaos as machine guns chattered, engines screamed at maximum power, and men shouted warnings and prayers in equal measure. A burst of cannon fire stitched across Baker 7's left wing, punching fist-sized holes through the aluminum skin, the explosive shells detonating on impact and creating jagged tears in the metal. The No. 2 engine, hit by multiple rounds, coughed black smoke, sputtered irregularly, and died, its propeller windmilling uselessly in the slipstream, creating drag that pulled the aircraft to the left. Morrison fought the controls as the aircraft, now asymmetric and sluggish, threatened to spiral out of formation. Chen, already moving before Morrison could issue orders, began the engine shutdown procedure, working quickly through the checklist while the aircraft shook from continuing interceptor attacks. He feathered the dead propeller, turning the blades edge-on to the wind to reduce drag, closed fuel valves to prevent fire, adjusted power on the remaining engines to compensate for the loss. Wheeler felt the aircraft vibrating differently, the whole structure protesting the unbalanced thrust, could hear stress in the airframe as Morrison fought to maintain control. They could fly on 3 engines, but they would be slower, more vulnerable, unable to keep up with the formation that was their primary protection against interceptor attacks. A lone bomber, or one that couldn't maintain formation speed, became an easy target, a wounded animal separated from the herd that predators would pursue until they brought it down. Morrison made the decision quickly, understanding they had no real choice. "We can't maintain formation speed," he said over the intercom, his voice tight with controlled fear, the emotion breaking through his usually calm demeanor. "We're dropping back. Navigator, I need an alternate route home. Something that keeps us away from known defenses, and I need it now." Wheeler's mind raced through options, visualizing the map he had studied so carefully during mission planning, considering courses and distances and fuel calculations all simultaneously. The direct route would take them back over the same heavily defended territory they had just crossed, but now they would be alone, without the protection of formation or fighters, a crippled bomber limping through airspace where German interceptors hunted for exactly such targets. The fuel situation was critical. The number 2 engine had been their most efficient, running smoother than the others, and losing it meant their range was significantly reduced. Every mile mattered now. Every calculation had to be perfect. He pulled out his maps, spreading them across his navigation table despite the turbulence that made the aircraft buck and shake, recalculated fuel consumption with 3 engines, factored in their reduced speed and the headwinds they would face on the return journey. His fingers moved across the charts, measuring distances with dividers, computing angles with his protractor, considering options that might keep them alive long enough to reach Allied territory. The numbers told a harsh story. The direct route was impossible. They would run out of fuel long before reaching safety. The fuel consumption on 3 engines was higher than normal, the drag from the damaged wing section adding to their problems, and the headwinds would slow them even further. He needed a route that was longer in absolute distance, but avoided the heaviest defenses where they might sustain additional damage, where fuel-intensive evasive maneuvers might be necessary, where interceptors might find them again. "I have a route," Wheeler said, his voice steadier than he felt, projecting confidence that the crew needed to hear, even as uncertainty gnawed at him. "It's longer in distance but avoids the major defense belts. We angle southwest, cross the Rhine south of our original track, then follow the Vosges mountain range westward. Lower altitude, more terrain masking from radar and visual spotters. There's a risk of mountain weather, but the cloud cover might work in our favor, hiding us from interceptors." Morrison didn't hesitate, didn't question, didn't second-guess. "Give me the heading." 245 degrees, Wheeler said, double-checking his calculations even as he spoke. "We need to descend to 12,000 feet to stay below the cloud bases and use terrain masking effectively. The mountains should hide us from radar, and the clouds will make visual detection much harder." Chen's voice cut in, concerned but professional. "Skipper, at 12,000 we'll burn more fuel due to higher air density and increased drag. The engines work harder at lower altitude, and if we hit icing conditions in those clouds, we could have serious problems. Ice accumulation on the wings and control surfaces could make the aircraft uncontrollable." "I know," Morrison said flatly, "but we don't have better options. We can't fight off interceptors alone, and we can't survive another pass through those defense belts. Navigator, how tight are we on fuel? Give me the worst case." Wheeler had already run the calculations multiple times, checking and rechecking his work, because the margin for error was essentially 0. "With current consumption rates and the distance we need to cover, assuming no significant headwinds beyond forecast, and no need for additional evasive maneuvers, we'll arrive back at base with approximately 20 to 30 minutes of fuel remaining. That's assuming everything goes right. If we encounter problems, unexpected weather, stronger headwinds, any kind of delays, we might not make it." The crew absorbed this information in silence that lasted several seconds, each man processing what it meant. 20 to 30 minutes of fuel margin meant virtually no room for error, no ability to circle if the landing strip was occupied by damaged aircraft from earlier missions, No second chances if they missed their approach and had to go around. They would get one opportunity to put the aircraft on the ground, and if anything went wrong, they would be attempting a dead-stick landing in a bomber weighing over 30 tons, an aircraft never designed to glide. "Make it work," Morrison said simply, the two words carrying complete trust and terrible responsibility. Then he banked the aircraft onto Wheeler's heading and began the descent toward the mountains, leaving the relative safety of the formation and committing their lives to Wheeler's calculations. The next 3 hours tested every skill Wheeler possessed and revealed reserves of capability he hadn't known he had. Flying at lower altitude meant stronger winds and turbulence, constantly shifting conditions that required continuous recalculation of their position and course. The cloud cover that provided concealment also obscured landmarks, forcing Wheeler to rely entirely on dead reckoning, using airspeed, heading, and time to determine where they were over a landscape he couldn't see. Navigating through three-dimensional space, using only mathematics and his mental model of the terrain, he worked with an intensity that blocked out everything else, the fatigue that made his eyes burn and his head ache, the fear that whispered they wouldn't make it, the cold that had crept through his flight suit despite the heated interior until his hands shook slightly when he tried to write. He filled page after page with calculations, numbers flowing across the paper in neat columns, cross-checking his work constantly, verifying his numbers with redundant computations, building a mental map of their position that had to be accurate, because if it wasn't, they would fly past their base and run out of fuel over the Atlantic Ocean. Chen moved through the aircraft, monitoring systems with obsessive attention to detail, adjusting fuel mixtures to squeeze every possible mile from their remaining tanks, watching engine temperatures and oil pressures and the 1,000 other parameters that determined whether machinery kept functioning. He reported the numbers to Wheeler constantly, fuel remaining updated every 5 minutes, consumption rates tracked precisely, both of them performing a delicate mathematical dance that would determine whether they lived or died. The two men fell into a rhythm of communication, Chen calling out fuel remaining, Wheeler confirming estimated distance to base, both of them understanding implicitly what the other needed to know. The flight engineer and the navigator, working in concert, each trusting the other's expertise, represented integration functioning exactly as it should, collaboration based purely on competence with lives, depending on both men being absolutely right. Morrison flew with a steadiness that Wheeler had to admire, holding headings exactly as Wheeler called them, maintaining precise airspeeds despite the damaged aircraft's tendency to wander, and the turbulence that constantly tried to push them off course. The pilot who had protested Wheeler's assignment, who had filed formal complaints about integration experiments, now trusted him completely, betting his life and the lives of his crew on Wheeler's ability to guide them home through clouds and mountains and enemy territory. Twice they emerged from clouds to find themselves closer to mountain peaks than was comfortable, rocky summits appearing suddenly through gaps in the mist, requiring Morrison to climb rapidly while Wheeler adjusted their course to find safer passage. The Vosges Mountains were beautiful and deadly, offering concealment at the cost of constant danger, one navigation error potentially putting them into terrain they couldn't avoid. Once they spotted what might have been interceptors in the distance, dark silhouettes against clouds that could have been enemy fighters, or could have been other bombers, they couldn't take the chance of waiting to find out. Morrison immediately dove back into the clouds, adding miles to their route, burning precious fuel, accepting the cost because the alternative was certain destruction. Every deviation, every course correction, every unplanned maneuver ate into their shrinking fuel reserves. Wheeler recalculated constantly, updating his estimates as conditions changed, as fuel consumption varied, as their actual progress differed slightly from planned progress. The margins grew tighter with each passing mile. His initial estimate of 20 to 30 minutes of fuel remaining at base had shrunk to 15 to 25 minutes, still survivable but leaving even less room for error. The weather deteriorated as they flew west, a winter storm system moving in from the Atlantic faster than forecasters had predicted, another variable adding complexity to already complex calculations. Morrison contacted their home base via radio, received a weather update that confirmed what they could already see. Conditions were rapidly degrading, visibility dropping, winds increasing, ceiling lowering, The field would be marginal for landing by the time they arrived, and deteriorating further with each passing minute. The tower controller, hearing about their fuel situation and battle damage, suggested they might want to consider diverting to another base with better weather. Morrison checked with Wheeler before responding. "Do we have fuel to divert?" the pilot asked, already knowing the answer, but needing it confirmed. Wheeler looked at his latest calculations, at the fuel remaining numbers Chen had just reported, at the distances to alternate bases. "No, sir," he said quietly. "We land at home base, or we don't land anywhere under power. We're committed." Morrison keyed his radio. "Tower, Baker 7. We're coming to you regardless of weather. Have emergency equipment standing by. We'll make one approach and we will be landing regardless." The finality in the pilot's voice left no room for argument. They would attempt to land in weather that would normally ground aircraft, would make that attempt with fuel tanks nearly empty, and a damaged aircraft that handled poorly even under ideal conditions. The alternative, attempting to ditch the bomber or bail out over unfamiliar territory in a storm, offered even worse odds of survival. Wheeler ran the numbers again, triple-checking his calculations, because lives depended on being right. "How far, navigator?" Morrison asked for perhaps the 10th time in the last hour. 43 miles, Wheeler said, consulting his latest plot. 12 minutes at current speed. We should begin descent in 6 minutes to arrive at pattern altitude, with enough airspeed to maneuver. Chen reported fuel status unprompted. Number 3 tank is reading close to empty, maybe 5 minutes left. Number 1 and 4 have approximately 20 combined minutes at current consumption. "It's going to be very tight, Skipper." "Everybody strap in tight," Morrison ordered. "Check your harnesses. Secure any loose equipment. This is going to be sporty." The final approach took place in conditions that would normally have grounded all flights, weather that training instructors used as examples of situations to avoid. Visibility was less than half a mile. Rain mixing with sleet hammered the windscreen with enough force to make conversation difficult, and crosswinds gusted to 30 miles per hour, buffeting the aircraft and making it difficult to maintain heading. Morrison brought the crippled bomber down through the murk, guided by Wheeler's calculations of when they should be over the field, and by radio bearings from the tower, flying partially blind and completely committed. They broke out of the clouds at 300 feet, less than a minute from impact with the ground, and found the runway almost exactly where Wheeler had said it would be, slightly to the right, but close enough that Morrison could correct without difficulty. The pilot fought the controls as wind tried to push them off course, the aircraft yawing and dipping on 3 engines, the asymmetric thrust making every correction a battle. He added power to compensate for the crosswind, fought to maintain center line, held the aircraft off the ground until the last possible moment to bleed off speed. The landing was hard, the bomber slamming onto the runway with enough force that everyone felt it through their seats, bouncing twice before the main gear settled firmly. Morrison immediately applied brakes, carefully because too much pressure on wet runway could cause a skid. Not enough would have them running out of runway. The aircraft slowed, rolling through sheets of rain and spray, finally coming to a stop at the far end of the runway, with perhaps 200 feet of concrete remaining. Chen immediately checked the fuel gauges, reading numbers that made the fuel situation terrifyingly real. "Number 3 tank is dry," he reported, his voice carrying the weight of just how close they had come. "Number 1 and 4 have about 7 minutes combined, maybe less." We landed with 7 minutes of fuel remaining. 7 minutes. After a 7-hour flight through enemy territory, combat damage and deteriorating weather, they had landed with 7 minutes of fuel remaining. 7 minutes between survival and becoming another statistic. Another crew lost over Europe. Another set of telegrams delivered to families. Another group of names added to the lengthening casualty lists that documented the cost of the air war. The crew sat in silence for a long moment, processing what they had just survived, the compounding series of problems they had overcome, the razor-thin margins that had separated success from disaster. The only sounds were the pinging of cooling engines, the drumming of rain on the fuselage, the harsh breathing of men who had been running on adrenaline and were now starting to crash as the immediate danger passed. Then Morrison unbuckled his harness, turned to face the crew compartment, and looked directly at Wheeler. The pilot's face was pale with fatigue, his hands still gripping the control yoke although the aircraft was safely stopped. his voice hoarse when he finally spoke. "That was the finest piece of navigation I've ever seen," Morrison said clearly, loud enough that everyone in the crew compartment could hear. "You brought us home when nobody else could have. When I didn't know if we'd make it, when the numbers looked impossible, you found a way. I was wrong about you, dead wrong. I was prejudiced and stupid, and I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. And I'll tell anyone who asks that you're the best navigator in this squadron, maybe the best navigator in the entire group. You saved our lives today, and I will never forget it." The other crew members, even Riggs, who had requested a transfer to avoid serving with Wheeler, even Kowalski, who had refused to speak to him for weeks, nodded or murmured agreement. The bombardier extended his hand toward Wheeler's station, and Wheeler shook it, feeling the tension of 3 months of isolation, 3 months of proving himself, 3 months of excellence in the face of contempt, finally beginning to crack and dissolve. But the full impact of that flight wouldn't become clear until the next day, when Morrison filed his mission report. The captain didn't simply note Wheeler's competent performance in the dry language typical of such documents. He wrote a detailed account of how Wheeler's navigation had saved the crew, emphasizing the skill and composure required to guide a damaged aircraft through defended territory and marginal weather using only dead reckoning and mathematical precision. He described Wheeler's calculations, the alternate routing that had avoided the heaviest defenses, the fuel management that had brought them home with minutes to spare. Morrison's report made its way up the chain of command, landing on the desk of a colonel named Marcus Patterson, who was compiling data on the integration experiment. Patterson had been skeptical of the program initially, but he was also a pragmatist who understood that the military needed every capable person it could find. He added Morrison's report to a growing file of evidence that performance, not prejudice, should determine who served in what role. A file that included similar accounts from other units, other missions, other instances of personnel of color exceeding expectations and demonstrating exceptional capability. That file would eventually reach the offices in Washington, where policy was made, becoming part of the documentation that supported broader integration of the military. Generals and politicians who had opposed integration, who had cited concerns about unit cohesion and combat effectiveness, found themselves confronted with evidence they couldn't dismiss, concrete examples of how restricting assignments based on race weakened rather than strengthened military capability. But there were more immediate effects closer to home. Other bomber crews, hearing what happened to Baker 7, hearing Morrison's account of Wheeler's navigation, began requesting Wheeler when their regular navigators were unavailable or when particularly difficult missions were planned. Pilots who had shared Morrison's initial skepticism started looking at the data rather than the assumptions, recognizing that skill came in all colors and that up at 20,000 feet, the only thing that mattered was whether someone could do the job and do it well enough to keep you alive. Wheeler flew 23 more missions with Morrison's crew, and each one reinforced the bond forged during that desperate flight home from Mannheim. They became one of the most effective crews in the squadron, their mission success rate exceeding 90%, their ability to navigate difficult situations becoming legendary within the group. Morrison credited Wheeler's navigation, but the truth was more complex. The entire crew had learned to function as a unit, to trust each other completely, to put survival and mission success ahead of prejudice and social hierarchy. Chen became a genuine friend, the first Wheeler had in the military, someone he could talk to about things beyond missions and navigation. They would sit together in the mess hall, discussing plans for after the war, families back home, the changes they saw happening in the military, and what those changes might mean for the broader society. Chen talked about reopening his family's laundry business in San Francisco, expanding it perhaps into a restaurant that served the food he remembered from childhood. Wheeler talked about using the GI Bill to attend college, maybe becoming a teacher, passing on knowledge the way Miss Patterson had done for him. Morrison wrote commendation after commendation, documenting Wheeler's exceptional abilities in official language that carried weight with promotion boards and assignment committees. By the spring of 1944, Wheeler was training new navigators, including several other men of color who were entering the service as the integration program expanded. He taught them the technical skills they needed, but also the psychological resilience required to excel in an environment that often seemed designed to make them fail. "Excellence is your only weapon," he would tell them, echoing Chen's advice from that first flight. "They expect you to fail. They're watching for any excuse to prove their assumptions right. So you can't just be good, you have to be exceptional. It's not fair, it shouldn't be necessary, but it's reality. Master your craft so completely that they can't dismiss you, can't ignore you, can't deny your capability. Make yourself undeniable." The transformation wasn't universal or immediate. Wheeler still faced discrimination, still encountered officers and enlisted men who judged him by his skin rather than his skills, still had to prove himself repeatedly to people who should have accepted the extensive documentation of his abilities. The military, like the society it served, would take years to fully embrace the principle that capability mattered more than color, that talent wasted due to prejudice was talent that could have contributed to victory. But December 7th, 1943, marked a turning point, both for Wheeler personally and for the slow, painful process of integration. It was one mission among thousands, one crew among hundreds of thousands, but it carried significance beyond its immediate tactical impact. It was a demonstration, documented and undeniable, that the old assumptions were wrong. That capability existed independently of the characteristics used to justify discrimination, that institutions that embraced merit over prejudice would always outperform those that clung to unjust hierarchies. Years later, after the war ended and the men of Baker 7 returned to civilian life, Morrison and Wheeler maintained a correspondence that lasted decades. The pilot, returned to his family's investment firm in Boston, would tell the story of that flight to anyone who would listen, using it as evidence that the old assumptions about who could do what were not just morally wrong, but practically foolish, economically inefficient, strategically counterproductive. He became an advocate for integration in his business, hiring practices that considered ability rather than background, arguing with other executives who maintained traditional prejudices. Chen opened a restaurant in San Francisco as he had planned, serving food that blended Chinese techniques with American ingredients, creating something new that reflected his own experience, bridging two cultures. He insisted that Wheeler visit whenever he was in California, and the two veterans would spend hours reminiscing about the war and the unexpected friendships it had forged, relationships that never would have developed in peacetime, but that had become fundamental to their understanding of themselves and the world. Wheeler himself remained in the military after the war, choosing to stay in an institution he could help change from within. He rose to the rank of major before retiring in 1963, his career spanning the period when the military transformed from a segregated force to one that, at least officially, evaluated personnel based on merit. He served as an instructor at the Air Force Academy, teaching navigation to a new generation of officers who would never know the segregated military he had fought to integrate, who would take for granted opportunities he had to fight for. His students, of all backgrounds, learned not just the mathematics of navigation, but the importance of proving yourself through excellence, of meeting prejudice with performance so exceptional it couldn't be denied, of understanding that changing unjust systems required both persistence and capability. Wheeler never portrayed himself as heroic, always emphasized that he had simply done his job, but his example taught lessons that went far beyond navigation techniques. The crew of Baker 7 held reunions every 5 years, gatherings that started with the full complement of 9 men and grew smaller as the decades passed, and old age claimed its inevitable victories. They would meet in different cities, rotating between Boston, where Morrison lived, San Francisco, where Chen operated his restaurant, Birmingham, where Wheeler had returned after military retirement. They would share meals, tell stories that grew more polished with each retelling, remember friends who couldn't make it to this reunion or the next. At the final reunion, in 1991, only 4 of the original 9 crew members remained. Morrison was there, white-haired and walking with a cane after a hip replacement the previous year. Chen attended despite recent heart surgery, insisting he felt fine even though his children worried. Wheeler came from Birmingham, where he volunteered at the library that had replaced the colored library of his youth, teaching mathematics to students who struggled with concepts he had mastered decades earlier. Kowalski made it from Chicago, retired from the stockyards and now helping run a church food pantry. They gathered in a private room at Chen's restaurant, surrounded by photographs and memorabilia from the war, artifacts that represented a period of their lives that had defined everything that came after. Morrison raised his glass, his hand trembling slightly, not from fear but from age, his voice still carrying the authority of command even after all these years. To the navigator, he said, using the nickname that had stuck with Wheeler throughout his military career and beyond, the man who brought us home when nobody thought we had a chance, when the numbers looked impossible, when survival required perfection. The man who proved that courage and capability have nothing to do with the color of your skin, and everything to do with the content of your character. We're alive because of you, Jim. Our children exist because of you. Our grandchildren carry your legacy whether they know it or not. We will never forget what you did for us, and what you represented to everyone who came after. Wheeler, equally aged but still possessing the quiet dignity that had defined his service, still uncomfortable with praise but accepting it because these men had earned the right to give it, raised his own glass in acknowledgement. "I was just doing my job," he said, the same response he had given for nearly 5 decades. "Same as all of you. We were a crew and we got each other home. That's what mattered then and it's what matters now. We took care of each other when it counted." But it had been more than just a job, more than just one crew getting home from one mission. December 7th, 1943, represented a moment when individual actions challenged institutional assumptions, when one man's exceptional performance forced others to reconsider their prejudices, when the demands of survival created the conditions for change that policy and orders alone could never have achieved. It was one story among millions from the war, but it was a story that mattered, that carried lessons about human potential and institutional barriers, about the costs of prejudice and the power of excellence. The military would eventually integrate fully, though the process took years longer than it should have, and required constant pressure from advocates who understood that talent wasted due to prejudice was talent that could have helped win wars and save lives. Wheeler's story became part of the evidence used to support that change, a concrete example of why the old ways had to end, why institutions that judged people by merit rather than category would always outperform those that maintained discriminatory practices. The lessons extended beyond military integration, illustrating fundamental truths about human potential and organizational effectiveness that applied to every institution, every society, every situation where humans organized themselves for collective purpose. Organizations that wasted talent due to arbitrary discrimination weakened themselves, created inefficiencies, failed to utilize available resources effectively. The principle seemed obvious in retrospect, but it had taken years of evidence and advocacy to overcome entrenched prejudice. Wheeler's experience also revealed something profound about courage that went beyond the physical bravery of flying into combat, facing anti-aircraft fire and interceptors, risking death for tactical objectives. He had demonstrated a different kind of courage, the psychological fortitude required to persist in the face of contempt, to prove himself daily to people who had decided he couldn't measure up before he had even tried, to meet hostility with competence and prejudice with performance that could not be dismissed. That resilience, the strength required to maintain standards of excellence while carrying the additional burden of representing an entire group of people, while knowing that any mistake would be attributed not just to individual failing, but to supposed group characteristics, was its own form of heroism. Wheeler had carried that burden for 3 months before December 7th, had carried it throughout his military career, had carried it into retirement, where young people still looked to him as an example of what was possible despite barriers. Morrison's transformation mattered too, illustrating that people could change when confronted with evidence that contradicted their assumptions, that growth was possible even for those who had held sincere but wrong beliefs. The pilot had genuinely thought integration was dangerous, had argued against it in good faith, based on what he believed about unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. But when faced with irrefutable proof that those beliefs were wrong, when his survival depended on trusting a man he had been taught to dismiss, Morrison had chosen reality over prejudice. That capacity for growth, for admitting error and changing course, for placing truth above ego, was as important to progress as the competence of those fighting for opportunity. Social change required not just exceptional performance from those facing barriers, but also willingness from those maintaining barriers to acknowledge when they were wrong, to learn from experience, to update their understanding based on new evidence. The other crew members had their own journeys from skepticism to acceptance to advocacy. Kowalski, who had refused to speak to Wheeler for weeks, eventually became one of his strongest supporters, telling the story of that December mission to anyone who would listen. Riggs, who had requested a transfer to avoid serving with Wheeler, later admitted that his prejudices had been based on ignorance rather than experience, that knowing Wheeler personally had challenged and ultimately destroyed assumptions he had inherited from his culture. Each man processed the experience differently, but all of them came away changed, their assumptions tested and found wanting. Their understanding of capability and character expanded beyond the narrow limits they had inherited. They learned through necessity what many people never learn through instruction: that excellence comes in all backgrounds, that prejudice is a costly luxury that organizations and nations cannot afford, that survival sometimes requires abandoning comfortable assumptions in favor of uncomfortable truths. The broader historical context makes the story even more significant. 1943 was a pivotal year in World War II, when the tide was turning but victory remained far from certain, when the military needed every capable person it could find, when maximum efficiency in training and deployment could mean the difference between success and failure. The integration experiments, however limited and however grudgingly implemented, represented a pragmatic recognition that prejudice was a luxury a nation at war couldn't afford. The bomber crews facing enemy defenses over Europe provided a particularly stark illustration of why merit mattered more than background or category. At 20,000 feet, being pursued by interceptors or caught in anti-aircraft fire, no one cared about social hierarchy or cultural assumptions or traditional practices. The only questions that mattered were whether the navigator could get them home, whether the pilot could control the aircraft, whether the crew could work together effectively enough to complete the mission and survive. Performance was binary in combat. You either could do the job or you couldn't, and the consequences of failure were immediate and fatal. That clarity of purpose, that ruthless focus on results rather than credentials or background, created openings for change that peacetime might never have allowed. War accelerated social transformations, not because military leaders were progressive visionaries, but because survival required using every resource effectively, because waste of any kind, including waste of human talent, carried costs that defeat made unacceptable. Wheeler's opportunity came not from enlightened policy, but from desperate need, from a military stretched thin by casualties and the demands of global war, forced to reconsider assumptions about who could contribute and how. The integration program was an experiment born of necessity rather than idealism. But necessity sometimes accomplishes what idealism cannot, creating conditions where performance speaks louder than prejudice. The fact that Wheeler exceeded every standard, that his performance was not just adequate but exceptional, made his case irrefutable. He didn't just meet expectations, he surpassed them consistently and dramatically, creating a record that even the most committed skeptics couldn't dismiss. That excellence became ammunition for advocates of integration, proof that the barriers being maintained had no basis in capability, evidence that could be used to challenge discriminatory policies at the highest levels of command. The 7 minutes of fuel remaining when Baker 7 landed was a statistic that captured imaginations and crystallized the story's dramatic power. 7 minutes represented the margin between success and disaster, the quantified measure of how perfectly Wheeler had calculated every variable, how precisely he had navigated hundreds of miles through changing conditions. 7 minutes meant his work had been not just good, but nearly perfect, accounting for fuel consumption and wind drift, and all the countless factors that affected an aircraft's progress through three-dimensional space. Those 7 minutes became a symbol of how much skill and determination had been required to overcome not just enemy defenses and mechanical failures and bad weather, but also the additional burden of prejudice and doubt. 7 minutes was the difference between 9 men going home and 9 families receiving telegrams. 7 minutes was proof that excellence could overcome barriers, That capability mattered more than category, that assumptions about who could do what were empirically wrong. The story resonated across generations because it spoke to universal themes that remained relevant long after the specific circumstances had faded into history. The struggle for recognition and opportunity, the power of excellence to overcome bias, the transformation that occurred when people were forced to confront the gap between their assumptions and reality. All these elements connected to broader human experiences that transcended the particular details of one bomber crew in World War II. Veterans of later conflicts, people who had fought for civil rights in subsequent decades, anyone who had ever been judged unfairly and forced to prove themselves against arbitrary standards, could see their own experiences reflected in Wheeler's journey. The specifics varied, but the fundamental dynamics remained constant: the need to be exceptional just to be considered adequate, the burden of representation, the slow grinding work of changing minds through undeniable performance. Educational institutions began using the story as a teaching tool decades after the war, illustrating concepts ranging from navigation and mathematics to leadership and social change. Wheeler himself gave occasional lectures during his retirement, always deflecting personal praise to emphasize the broader lessons about talent and opportunity and the costs of prejudice. He would show students his original navigation logs from that December flight, pages yellowed with age, but still clearly displaying the calculations and course corrections that had brought Baker 7 home. The logs revealed something beyond just technical competence. There were no erasures, no panic-induced errors, no signs of the fear and stress Wheeler must have been experiencing. The numbers were precise and methodical, the handwriting steady throughout, the logic clear and consistent. It was the work of someone who had shut out every distraction, every doubt, every external pressure, and focused entirely on the problem that needed solving, maintaining absolute clarity when lives depended on getting the answer right. That ability to perform under extreme pressure, to maintain focus when the consequences of error were fatal, to think clearly when fear and fatigue pulled toward panic, was perhaps Wheeler's greatest gift. The technical skills could be taught, the mathematics could be learned, but the psychological strength to apply those skills flawlessly in combat conditions was something rarer and more valuable. It was a quality the military had almost discarded, talent that had almost been wasted, capability that would have been lost if not for test scores too exceptional to ignore, and a desperate need for qualified personnel. Morrison kept his promise to tell anyone who would listen about Wheeler's abilities, becoming an unexpected advocate for integration and equal opportunity in his post-war life. The pilot used his privileged background and military credentials to challenge people who shared his earlier prejudices, telling the story of December 7th in boardrooms and country clubs, at business meetings and social gatherings, anywhere people expressed assumptions about capability correlating with race. He would recount the mission in detail, emphasizing not just what Wheeler had done, but why it mattered, why the old assumptions had to be abandoned, why the military and the nation and businesses and institutions of every kind would be stronger when they stopped wasting talent due to arbitrary discrimination. Morrison's advocacy carried weight precisely because of his background, because he couldn't be dismissed as someone with an ideological agenda, because his transformation from skeptic to advocate testified to the power of direct experience to change minds. The friendship between Morrison and Wheeler, unlikely and profound, became its own statement about human possibility. Two men from vastly different backgrounds, separated by class and race and geography, and all the social divisions that American society maintained, had found common ground in shared danger and mutual respect. The relationship illustrated that prejudice was learned, not innate, that exposure and experience could overcome cultural conditioning, that people were capable of growth when circumstances required it, and when they chose to embrace rather than resist the lessons experience offered. Chen's role shouldn't be overlooked in understanding how Wheeler succeeded and how Baker 7 survived. The flight engineer's early acceptance of Wheeler, based on Chen's own experiences with discrimination against Chinese Americans, created a bridge that helped integrate Wheeler into the crew. Having even one ally made the isolation less absolute, provided a foundation for Wheeler to build on as he proved himself to the others through consistent, excellent performance. Chen's decision to judge Wheeler by performance rather than appearance was its own form of moral courage, a willingness to stand apart from crew consensus in the name of fairness, a recognition that the prejudice being directed at Wheeler was unjust and that participating in it would be wrong. That individual moral choice created conditions that allowed excellence to flourish, that gave Wheeler the space he needed to demonstrate his capabilities, that showed other crew members an alternative to the hostility they had initially embraced. The fact that three men, Morrison and Chen and Wheeler, from three different backgrounds and experiences, all converged on the same fundamental truth. That capability mattered more than category. That performance should determine opportunity, suggested something hopeful about human nature and human potential. Despite all the cultural programming, all the institutional barriers, all the social pressure to maintain discriminatory systems, individuals could still recognize excellence when they saw it, and could still choose to acknowledge reality over prejudice. The mission itself, with its combination of combat damage, navigation challenges, fuel constraints, and weather difficulties, represented an almost perfect test of Wheeler's abilities under the most demanding conditions. He faced every possible variable that could complicate aerial navigation, every challenge that could reveal weakness or inadequacy, and he handled each one with precision and composure that left no room for doubt. No one could claim his success was luck, that the circumstances had been easy, that anyone else could have done as well. The objective difficulty of what he accomplished made the achievement undeniable. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.